Inside a crowded courtroom, tension explodes when a powerful judge unleashes open racism against a black lawyer. The judge's arrogance fills the air, but the lawyer's calm presence unsettles the room. A symbolic act of humiliation takes place, yet the lawyer's powerful response turns the atmosphere heavy. As the judge lashes back, a mysterious figure enters and everything shifts. "We don't let your kind speak in my courtroom." The sentence cut through the silence like a blade. It wasn't whispered. It wasn't disguised. It was spat with venom, filling the cavernous chamber with a shock so sharp that every head in the gallery snapped toward the bench. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale air, a place where whispers of justice were supposed to echo. Instead, the only sound now was disbelief. The mahogany walls reflected the weight of power, lined with flags and plaques that declared fairness but delivered fear. Rows of wooden benches overflowed with bodies, journalists clutching pens, families wringing hands, law clerks pretending neutrality while their eyes betrayed discomfort. At the center of it all sat Judge Horace Whitmore, a man who carried his robe like a crown. He leaned forward in his chair, chin lifted, pale eyes narrowed with the arrogance of someone who had never once been challenged in his own domain. His fingers tapped the gavel, slow and deliberate, as if daring anyone to defy him. His voice had the tone of entitlement, of certainty that his word was not just law, it was gospel. Opposite him stood Malcolm Reed, the black lawyer who had just been stripped of dignity in front of 100 watching eyes. Malcolm did not bow his head. He did not allow the insult to wrinkle his face or tremble his voice. His suit was simple, gray with faint pinstripes, his tie knotted with care. His shoes were polished but not new, carrying scuffs that hinted at long days and longer nights of preparation. He stood with his spine like iron, eyes calm, as though Judge Whitmore's words had been nothing more than wind. That calm was a weapon. Whitmore sneered. "Did you hear me, counselor? I won't have this circus. Sit down before I have you removed." A hush blanketed the courtroom, heavy and suffocating. The jurors shifted uncomfortably. The bailiff's hand twitched near his belt. Even the clerk avoided Malcolm's gaze, staring down at her papers as if ink could save her from shame. Malcolm inhaled slowly, chest rising and falling in rhythm. His hand slid into his briefcase, and for a heartbeat, the room stiffened, tension sparking like static before a storm. But what he withdrew was not a weapon, not a protest, only a single piece of paper. He placed it on the desk with deliberate care. The motion was symbolic. Where the judge used power to humiliate, Malcolm used the law to speak. It was the quiet resistance of a man who refused to bend. Then his voice rose, not loud, not defiant, but steady and unshakable. "Justice doesn't need your permission to breathe." The line carried like a drumbeat. It was not shouted, yet it filled every corner of the room. It reached the ears of the young intern scribbling notes, of the old woman clutching her purse in the gallery, of the reporter whose pen froze mid-sentence. Something shifted, invisible but undeniable. Judge Whitmore's face darkened. His lips twisted as though the air itself had turned bitter. He slammed his palm against the bench. "How dare you? Do you think you can stand in here and The gavel thundered once, twice, 3 times. Each crack was a shot fired into silence. "This is my courtroom." Whitmore's voice quaked with fury. "My word is law here." Malcolm didn't blink. He didn't move. His stillness was louder than any scream. Gasps fluttered again when Whitmore snatched the motion paper from Malcolm's desk and tore it in half. The shredded edges floated briefly before landing on the polished floor like wounded birds. A symbolic strike meant to remind everyone. Power could rip truth apart, but Malcolm only leaned closer, his eyes steady, his voice soft but razor-sharp. Paper burns, truth doesn't. The words hung, thick as smoke, refusing to die. The courtroom's tension quivered, fragile like glass. Some people looked away, ashamed. Others leaned forward, transfixed. Even the jurors who had walked in with bias felt the seed of unease pressing into their conscience. Whitmore's chest rose and fell with rage. He gripped the gavel, knuckles white, veins straining on his wrist. His arrogance demanded obedience, yet something else, something unfamiliar, crept into his expression. Unease. And then the interruption. The tall wooden doors at the back groaned open with an echo. That silenced even Whitmore's fury. Heads turned sharply. The bailiff stiffened. Shadows stretched across the marble floor as a figure stepped inside. Footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate, the rhythm of inevitability. The judge's lips parted. His eyes widened, color draining from his face. His next insult collapsed in his throat, swallowed by sudden recognition. The gallery leaned forward. Who had entered? Why did the judge falter? Malcolm didn't smile, but his gaze flicked toward the door. The calm in his eyes deepened, almost as if he had been waiting for this very moment. The footsteps grew louder, each one heavier than the last. The entire courtroom froze, caught in suspense, held hostage by the presence of the unseen figure walking steadily toward the front. The gavel trembled in Whitmore's hand. The silence was suffocating. And then the chapter closed on the sound of those footsteps, carrying with them the promise of revelation. The doors shut behind the figure with a resonant thud, sealing the courtroom into a new kind of silence. It was no longer the silence of arrogance, nor of submission. It was the silence of expectation. Something had entered the room that even Judge Whitmore's authority could not smother. The man walked with deliberate pace, each footfall clicking against the marble floor, echoing like the ticking of a clock. He wore no robe of office, no uniform of power, yet his presence bent the room. A tailored navy suit draped across broad shoulders, his posture upright, his gaze steady. He carried himself like a man who belonged anywhere he stepped, as though permission was beneath him. Whitmore's lips quivered. He tried to form words, but his throat betrayed him. For the first time in years, he looked unsettled on his throne of oak. The gallery sensed it immediately. They leaned forward, whispering, their voices tiny sparks in the hush. Malcolm did not move, but his eyes followed the figure until they landed back on Whitmore. The lawyer's stillness felt deliberate, almost surgical. He knew the courtroom was watching, knew the balance was shifting, and he refused to rush the moment. The bailiff cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, may I ask your—" The figure lifted one hand, a subtle gesture that stopped the question midder. No force, no volume, only quiet command. The bailiff swallowed, retreating into silence. Whitmore slammed his gavel down once, the sound ringing sharp but hollow. "Order! I said order in this courtroom." The sound did not command obedience the way it once had. Instead, it cracked like an old drum, a reminder of power that was already slipping. The figure's eyes fixed on the judge, unwavering, piercing. And Whitmore faltered, "State your name." The judge barked, his voice strained, his composure crumbling around the edges. The man's voice was calm, resonant, carrying to every corner without effort. "You already know my name, Judge Whitmore," the gallery gasped. Heads turned. A ripple of electricity spread across the benches. The jurors shifted uneasily, sensing the invisible tide that had begun to rise. Whitmore's hand twitched around the gavel, but he didn't strike it again. His arrogance, once his weapon, was cracking under the pressure of recognition. His pale face betrayed fear, though he fought to mask it with rage. Malcolm's lips parted slightly, not in a smile but in acknowledgement. He knew, he had known from the moment those doors opened. but he would not speak it aloud. That power belonged to the man who had just arrived. For the first time, Malcolm addressed the court. "Your Honor, perhaps it is the court that needs to sit in silence for once." The words fell like stones into a pond. The ripples were immediate. The reporters scribbled furiously. A woman in the gallery nodded almost imperceptibly. Even the jury felt the sting, their eyes darting between Whitmore's trembling jaw and Malcolm's steady presence. Whitmore exploded, his voice sharp. "You are out of line. You have no standing to lecture this bench." His finger jabbed toward Malcolm, then toward the figure who now stood only a few feet away from the front. "And as for you, this intrusion will not be tolerated. Do you hear me?" The man did not flinch. He simply took another step forward. The space between him and the bench collapsed. His shadow fell across Whitmore's desk, swallowing the shredded paper that lay scattered like broken promises. The room held its breath. Malcolm leaned on his table, his hands folded neatly. His eyes were thoughtful, his expression unreadable. But inside, his pulse thrummed, not with fear, but with anticipation. This was not the collapse of dignity. This was the beginning of revelation. Whitmore's rage trembled into something else: desperation. He slammed the gavel again, his voice cracking. "I will have you both removed. Bailiff." But the bailiff did not move. His eyes flicked between Whitmore and the man in the navy suit. Authority itself had split, and the room could feel it. Whispers swelled like waves against the walls. "Who is he? Why does the judge look afraid?" Still, the man remained silent. His presence was not an intrusion. It was an indictment. He didn't need to announce who he was. The courtroom already knew something about him had power enough to rattle Whitmore's throne. Malcolm finally broke the tension. His voice measured. "Your Honor, for years you've spoken as though justice were yours to distribute. Today, it seems justice has walked in on its own." The gallery stirred, some eyes bright with awe, others with fear. The words had landed. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, as though distance could save him from the truth that had entered the room. His arrogance, once so impenetrable, now looked fragile. Like cracked porcelain, the man in the navy suit placed his hands behind his back, steady, unshaken. He had not raised his voice. He had not declared himself. Yet Whitmore's gavel trembled in his grip. The judge tried one last deflection. "This proceeding is out of order," he barked. "Everyone out." Court is adjourned, but nobody moved. Not the jury, not the clerk, not the gallery. The silence that followed was heavier than any verdict. For the first time in his career, "Judge." Whitmore's command fell into emptiness. Malcolm stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with a deliberate echo. His eyes fixed on Whitmore, then on the man in the navy suit, then back again. The balance had shifted. And Whitmore knew it. The chapter closed with the judge's trembling hand gripping the gavel, his eyes darting toward the figure whose presence alone had undone him. The stillness in the courtroom had stretched to breaking point. Every eye was fixed on the man in the navy suit. He stood near the front now, close enough that the glow of the overhead lights caught the sharp angles of his face. He carried no papers, no briefcase, no allies. Only presence. Judge Whitmore's fingers tapped furiously against the gavel. Sweat beaded at his temple, an uncharacteristic shine glistening beneath the artificial glow. His voice rose, brittle and shrill. "I asked you for your name, sir. State it, or this courtroom will treat you as an intruder." The man tilted his head slightly, as though surprised the question had even been asked. When he spoke, his words were calm, resonant, unhurried. "My name is Alexander Carter, United States Attorney General." The courtroom erupted. Gasps crashed against the walls. Reporters fumbled with pens and cameras. the sound of clicking shutters and scratching ink bursting like gunfire. The gallery murmured in disbelief, half rising from their seats. Even the jurors, instructed to silence, could not hide their shock, their mouths parted, their eyes wide. Whitmore's gavel struck desperately. Order! Order in this court! The cracks rang hollow, like the last protests of a broken instrument, but order had already slipped away. The Attorney General, the highest legal officer in the land, the man who stood above judges, above state prosecutors, the one who carried the authority of the Constitution itself. And here he was, standing in Whitmore's courtroom, staring him down with quiet authority. Whitmore's mouth opened, then closed again, his words tangled. His arrogance had not prepared him for this. He tried to lean forward, reclaiming his pose of control, but his body betrayed him. His shoulders slouched, his hands shook. The robe that once draped him like armor now seemed like a costume. Malcolm. Reed finally allowed himself a single breath of release. He had known Carter would come. He hadn't known when or how. But he had trusted in the inevitability of truth, and now it stood in flesh before him. Carter's voice rose again, cutting through the chaos. Judge Whitmore, you've sat in this chamber for years claiming the mantle of justice. Yet today, the nation will see not justice, but prejudice exposed in daylight. The words froze the room. No one dared speak. No one dared move. Whitmore's face flushed crimson. You have no jurisdiction to interfere in my proceedings. This is contempt of court. Carter stepped closer. The sound of his shoes echoed, like hammers on stone. Contempt of court, he repeated softly, almost as if tasting the words. Then his eyes locked on Whitmore. What the people witnessed was contempt for humanity, and I will not remain silent. Gasps rippled again. Reporters' pens flew across notepads, desperate to capture every syllable. The gallery leaned forward, their whispers swelling. Some faces showed awe, others fear, but all were riveted. Malcolm's heart pounded, but his face remained composed. He studied the judge carefully. The cracks in Whitmore's armor were spreading. His lips trembled, his eyes darted, his authority slipping like sand through clenched fists. Whitmore tried one last surge of arrogance. Bailiff, remove him, remove them both. The bailiff hesitated, his jaw tightened. He looked at Carter, then at Malcolm, then at the trembling gavel in Whitmore's fist. Slowly, almost shamefully, he lowered his hand. The refusal struck harder than any protest. Carter's tone sharpened. Even your own officer sees what you refuse to admit. Your authority is not divine, Judge Whitmore. It is conditional, on your adherence to justice. And when you spit on justice, you spit on the very seat you occupy. The words hit like thunder. Whitmore's chest heaved. His robe shifted as he tried to rise, but the movement was unsteady. For the first time, the great Judge Whitmore looked small behind the towering bench. The gallery stirred. One voice whispered, loud enough to carry, "He's finished." Malcolm finally spoke. His voice was soft, almost too soft, but it carried. Your Honor, this isn't the first time you've tried to silence me, but perhaps it will be the last. Whitmore's eyes snapped toward him, burning with fury, but Malcolm did not look away. The calm dignity in his gaze was more unbearable than any shouted insult. It reminded the judge, and everyone watching, that dignity could not be crushed. Carter turned slightly toward Malcolm, his expression unreadable, but his presence unmistakably protective. Then his gaze swung back to Whitmore. From this moment forward, Carter said, this courtroom is not a stage for your arrogance. It will be a stage for truth. The gallery erupted again, some clapping, some gasping, some shouting. The bailiff raised his hands for calm, but the tide of energy was unstoppable. The atmosphere had shifted permanently. The king on the bench had been stripped of his crown. Whitmore slammed the gavel again, his voice cracking. "This is my courtroom." But no one listened. Malcolm stood taller. Carter's shadow stretched across the floor, merging with his own. And for the first time, Judge Whitmore realized the courtroom was no longer his. The chapter closed on his trembling gavel, striking wood in vain as the sound was swallowed by the roar of truth. Chaos buzzed through the courtroom like a swarm of hornets. Reporters leaned over benches, notebooks flying open, pens scratching, cameras snapping in bursts of light. Every second carried the weight of history, and no one wanted to miss it. The gallery hummed with disbelief, voices overlapping in whispers and gasps. The Attorney General? Here? In this courtroom? Did you see Whitmore's face? It's over. He can't survive this. Through the noise, Judge Horace Whitmore sat rigid, his hands trembling against the gavel. His face flushed red, then drained pale, then flared again in blotches. He opened his mouth, but the words cracked and faltered like glass under strain. "This court," he began, then stopped. His voice had always been a weapon, booming, commanding, designed to silence. But now it stuttered against the wall of Carter's presence. The Attorney General stood unmoving, his hands clasped neatly behind his back, his face carved in calm authority. Malcolm Reed remained seated at his table, fingers steepled, his eyes steady. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The dignity in his silence rang louder than the judge's broken shouts. Whitmore slammed the gavel again, desperate to reclaim authority. The sound cracked, sharp and frantic. "This court is not a circus. You will all be silent or I'll clear the gallery." But the gallery did not move. The bailiff's eyes darted nervously between the judge and the Attorney General. His loyalty wavered, sweat beading along his brow. Everyone in the room could see it. The chain of command was broken. The robe no longer ruled. Carter finally stepped forward, his shoes echoing firmly against the polished floor. The simple rhythm silenced the crowd better than Whitmore's gavel had. He stopped at the center, turning slowly to face the gallery, the jurors, the reporters. His voice carried evenly, steady as stone. "You've witnessed something today that should never happen in an American courtroom," he said. "The law is meant to serve justice, not ego. It is meant to lift the voiceless, not silence them." Applause broke out in the gallery before the bailiff could even shush it. The sound was hesitant at first, then stronger, hands clapping like thunder against wood. Whitmore pounded his gavel again. "Enough. Sit down, all of you." His voice cracked, his face twisted. But his rage sounded small against the wave of approval Carter had sparked. Malcolm lifted his chin slightly, studying Whitmore with quiet eyes. He thought of every insult, every subtle humiliation, every case where the judge's bias had cut like a blade. And now, in front of the world, the blade dulled in his own hand. Whitmore leaned forward, his voice lowering to a hiss meant for Carter alone. "You've overstepped. You think this spectacle will save him?" He jabbed a finger toward Malcolm, venom dripping from every word. "He's nothing. Just another," but the sentence died in his throat. He had felt the eyes on him. The reporters leaned in, pens frozen. The gallery stiffened. Even the jurors held their breath, waiting. One more word, and his mask would shatter completely. Carter's eyes narrowed, steel glinting beneath calm. "Finish your sentence, Judge. Let the nation hear it." Whitmore's lips trembled. For a second, arrogance wrestled with fear. Then cowardice won. He sank back into his chair, mumbling instead, "This proceeding is compromised." Carter turned his gaze to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you came here to witness the pursuit of justice. Ask yourselves, have you seen justice today? A murmur ran through them. Some looked down at their hands. Others stared at Whitmore, shame flickering in their eyes. Whitmore's hand shook so violently that the gavel slipped from his grip and clattered against the floor. The sound echoed in the chamber like a verdict. The gallery gasped. A judge dropping his gavel was not just an accident, it was a symbol. Power had fallen from his hand. Malcolm's eyes followed the gavel as it rolled across the floor and came to rest against his shoe. He bent down, picked it up slowly, and held it in his hand. He studied it for a long moment, the tool of judgment, the weapon of arrogance. The entire courtroom held its breath. What would he do? Malcolm did not slam it. He did not claim it. He simply set it gently on the desk before him, the gesture quiet but cutting. A reminder, justice didn't belong to one man's fist. Whitmore's face collapsed into something unfamiliar. Not rage, not control, but desperation. His lips quivered, his breath uneven. He reached for words but found none. The mighty king of the bench now looked like a man trapped in his own robe, drowning in the silence of his own court. Carter stepped closer to him, lowering his voice so only the front row could hear, though the room's silence carried it to every ear. Your power was borrowed, Judge. Today the lender comes to collect. The gallery murmured again, some nodding, some whispering prayers, some holding back tears. Reporters scribbled furiously, ink scratching history into permanence. Malcolm folded his hands once more, his calm unbroken. Inside he felt the tide turning. Not just for him. For everyone who had ever walked into this courtroom and been silenced by prejudice disguised as law. The chapter closed with Judge Whitmore slumped back in his chair, robe heavy on his shoulders, eyes darting toward the cameras that now seemed to record his every breath. For the first time, he looked like what he was, a man cornered by truth. The silence after the gavel's fall lingered, heavy and suffocating. Every person in the courtroom felt it, the unspoken truth that something irreversible had just happened. Judge Whitmore's grip on power, once ironclad, now dangled by a fraying thread. A single cough broke the stillness. Then a voice, trembling but resolute, rose from the back of the gallery. "This isn't justice," a woman whispered. Others turned toward her. Her eyes brimmed with anger, not at the man on trial, but at the judge presiding. The words spread like sparks catching dry. "Grass. He's right," another voice said, louder this time. "This isn't justice." Whitmore's eyes darted toward the gallery, panic flashing beneath his glare. He slammed his palm against the desk. "Silence, or I will have this courtroom cleared." But the threat fell flat. The authority behind it no longer carried weight. Reporters scribbled feverishly, cameras flashing as if to document every crack forming in the judge's fortress. The jurors shifted uneasily in their seats, no longer sure whose authority they were bound to respect. Malcolm sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table. His eyes scanned the crowd, the mother clutching her son's hand, the old man gripping his cane with white knuckles, the young student leaning forward with fire in his gaze. They weren't just spectators anymore. They were witnesses. Witnesses who would not forget. Whitmore rose to his feet, his robe swaying as though it weighed him down. "You will obey this court," he thundered, but his voice cracked on the last word, betraying his fear. Attorney General Carter didn't flinch. He kept his gaze level, his posture unshaken. "The people don't obey arrogance, Judge," he said calmly. "They respect justice. And right now, all they see is its absence." The gallery erupted, not in shouts this time, but in applause. Hands smacked against palms, a sound that rolled like thunder and shook the wooden benches. Whitmore's face contorted with rage. "Bailiff, remove them." Every last one of them. The bailiff hesitated. His hand twitched toward his baton, but then froze. He glanced at Carter, then at the gallery, then at Malcolm, the man he was supposed to drag away. For a moment, the entire courtroom held its breath, watching his decision. Finally, the bailiff stepped back, his arms folding stiffly at his side. "I can't do that, Your Honor." A gasp swept through the courtroom. Whitmore's jaw dropped, his authority slipping like sand through his fingers. "You dare defy me?" The bailiff swallowed hard. "I swore to uphold the law. Not this." The gallery roared in approval, stamping feet now joining clapping hands. The room pulsed with energy, voices rising, united. It was no longer a trial. It was a reckoning. Whitmore pounded his fist against the bench, desperate to be heard above the noise. "This is my courtroom. Mine." His voice echoed, shrill and broken. Malcolm finally rose to his feet. His movements were slow, deliberate. The noise softened as eyes turned toward him. Even the reporters who had been scrambling to capture every word lowered their pens. Malcolm's voice was steady, low but commanding, every syllable dipped in quiet dignity. "This was never your courtroom, Judge. It belongs to the people. And they've spoken." Whitmore's face drained of color. For a second, he seemed small, just a man in a robe, stripped of the illusion of power. His lips trembled as if to respond, but no words came. Carter stepped closer to Malcolm, his hand resting lightly on his shoulder, signaling silent solidarity. Together they stood, a picture of calm resistance against the storm of arrogance collapsing. In on itself, one of the jurors, a young woman with nervous eyes, raised her voice timidly. "If justice has been compromised, how can we deliver a verdict?" The room froze again. Whitmore seized on the question, desperate for a lifeline. "You will deliver a verdict because I command it." He barked, but Malcolm turned his gaze to the juror, answering softly, as though they were speaking alone. "A verdict means nothing if the trial is poisoned. The truth doesn't need permission to exist. It only needs courage to be spoken." Her eyes widened, her lips pressing together. Around her, other jurors shifted, some nodding ever so slightly. The gallery swelled with whispers that rose into chants. First soft, then stronger, echoing off the walls. "Justice! Justice! Justice!" The chant rattled Whitmore's bones. His robe clung to him like a shroud, his breath coming shallow, uneven. He gripped the bench, knuckles white, as though the wood itself might anchor him against the rising tide. But the tide was unstoppable. Carter raised his hand, and the chant slowly quieted. He spoke once more, his tone unwavering. "The people have already rendered their judgment, Judge Whitmore. The question now is whether you'll accept it or be buried beneath it." Whitmore stared at him, eyes wild, lips trembling. His chest rose and fell in sharp bursts, as though the very air resisted him. Malcolm remained standing, his posture unyielding, his silence louder than the judge's rage. Inside, he felt the shift solidify, the courtroom no longer bent to arrogance. It leaned toward truth. And as Whitmore slumped back into his chair, eyes darting nervously toward the doors, it was clear to all. The cracks in his crown were now wide enough to swallow him whole. The echo of the chant still rang in Judge Whitmore's ears long after the voices had subsided. Justice, justice. The word felt like a hammer striking his skull with every beat. He sat rigid in his chair, fingers gripping the armrests as though clinging to the last fragments of control. His once flawless posture sagged beneath the invisible weight pressing down on him. His eyes darted around the courtroom, the jurors avoiding his gaze, the reporters scribbling with ruthless precision, the gallery watching him not with fear, but with judgment. The robe that had always cloaked him in authority now felt suffocating, its folds heavy, its fabric damp against his skin. For the first time in decades, Whitmore realized the robe did not protect him. It exposed him. Your Honor. Carter's voice broke the silence, firm but respectful. Perhaps a recess would allow tempers to cool. Whitmore's lips curled into a sneer. A recess? So you can continue your circus outside these walls? His voice cracked, betraying the tremor in his chest, but Carter didn't flinch. He spoke evenly, as though addressing a child. Sometimes. The truth doesn't wait for permission, Judge, and it seems the people have already found their voice. Whitmore slammed the gavel so hard the wood splintered. The crack echoed like a gunshot. The gallery flinched but did not retreat. Instead, whispers rose again, rippling like waves against a crumbling shore. Malcolm, still standing, let his gaze drift across the courtroom. His calmness unsettled Whitmore more than any outburst could. The young man's eyes carried a weight that the judge could not bear to meet, the weight of quiet certainty. Whitmore finally snapped. "You, defendant," he shouted, his finger trembling as it pointed at Malcolm. "You sit there with your silence, your smugness, as though you're above this court. Do you think your dignity will save you?" The words bounced against the walls, sharp and shrill, but Malcolm did not flinch. His voice, low and steady, rolled across the room like slow thunder. "No, Judge, my dignity isn't mine to save. It's yours to destroy. And you've been trying since the moment I walked in." A gasp spread through the gallery. Reporters scribbled faster, cameras flashing like lightning bolts in a storm. Whitmore's face turned crimson. "How dare you?" he spat. "I'll have your words stricken from the record." But Carter stepped forward, his expression unshaken. "You can strike words, Judge, but you cannot erase what everyone here has heard." The gallery broke into murmurs again, some voices rising louder than others. The chant from earlier threatened to resurface. Whitmore's chest heaved, his breath shallow, his robe clinging tighter. His crown of authority had cracks, and now the whole world could see the pieces begin to crumble. One juror, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, spoke hesitantly. "Your Honor, perhaps it would be wise to consider silence." Whitmore snapped, his voice desperate, almost pleading. He pounded the bench again, but the sound no longer carried weight. The gavel was just wood now. Nothing more. Malcolm's voice rose once more, not with anger, but with piercing clarity. "A crown made of fear was never strong enough to last." The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. For a moment, even Whitmore froze. The phrase slashed through his chest like a blade, carving out the truth he'd spent years hiding from. Fear had always been his weapon. Fear of his judgment. Fear of his verdict. Fear of his reputation. And now, fear of losing it all. He tried to speak, but his voice trembled. This is my courtroom." But no one believed him anymore. Not even himself. The bailiff, who had once stood like a soldier at Whitmore's command, took a step back toward the gallery, his arms crossed firmly. His silence spoke volumes. He no longer served a man. He served justice. Whitmore's hand shook as he clutched the bench. Sweat trickled down his temple, leaving dark stains on his robe. His crown was slipping, and he could feel it tumbling. Piece by piece, faster than he could grasp, the gallery began to hum again, the voices rising not in rebellion this time, but in certainty. The people could smell the collapse. Whitmore looked down at Malcolm, who still hadn't moved, still hadn't raised his voice, still hadn't broken. And in that stillness, Whitmore saw his own reflection, not the robe, not the authority, not the gavel. Just a man, stripped bare, trembling before the truth. For the first time, Judge Whitmore looked smaller than the man he sought to destroy. The courtroom had shifted. The crown had cracked. And though Whitmore refused to admit it aloud, he knew deep in his bones The collapse had already begun. The courtroom was no longer Whitmore's domain. The air carried a charge, restless and unyielding, like the sky before. A storm. Every eye lingered not on the bench, not on the gavel, but on Malcolm. His stillness had become the axis around which the entire room turned. Whitmore's robe sagged on his shoulders, the black fabric damp with sweat. He clutched the broken gavel as though it were a lifeline. But the gavel had lost its voice, and so had he. His crown of authority was now a cracked ornament, slipping further with every heartbeat. A sound cut through the silence, the soft scrape of a chair. An elderly woman in the gallery stood slowly, her back hunched, her face lined with decades of struggle. Her hands trembled, but her eyes blazed with quiet fire. She lifted her cane, tapping it once against the marble floor. Tap. The sound echoed like a drum. Everyone turned. Then, from the back row, a young man rose and tapped his foot against the ground in rhythm with the cane. Tap. Another voice joined. Then another. Within seconds, the gallery had become a chorus of soft taps, feet, canes, hands against benches. The rhythm built like a heartbeat, steady, undeniable. Whitmore's breath caught in his throat. The sound wasn't chaotic like chance. It wasn't loud enough to be called rebellion. It was worse. It was unity. Malcolm finally turned his head toward the sound, his eyes glistening. For the first time since the trial began, he allowed himself a small nod, a gesture of recognition, not for himself, but for them. Whitmore slammed what remained of his gavel. Silence. He barked, his voice cracking. This is contempt. Of court. But the taps continued. Tap, tap, tap. A slow, unbreakable rhythm. Whitmore's fists pounded the bench. Bailiff. Stop him. Remove them at once. The bailiff didn't move. He stood tall, his jaw clenched, his gaze locked on the gallery. Slowly, deliberately, he folded his arms across his chest. It was his quiet declaration. He no longer belonged to the judge's shadow. Whitmore's eyes bulged. You dare defy me? The bailiff didn't answer. He didn't need to. The rhythm grew louder, the taps now filling the room like the march of unseen footsteps. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances. For weeks they had sat silently, bound by the weight of Whitmore's presence. But now the weight shifted. One juror, a woman with sharp eyes, lifted her hand and tapped her knuckle against the jury box. Tap. The sound merged with the rhythm, and another juror followed. And another. Whitmore's chest heaved. This is anarchy. This is madness. But no one listened. The rhythm rose like thunder under his feet, vibrating through the walls, pulsing against his rib cage. He tried to shout over it, but his voice was too small, too thin. Drowned by the unity of the people. Malcolm finally spoke. His words were not shouted. They flowed with the rhythm, calm and precise. You can silence one voice, Judge, but can you silence them all? The tap surged louder, faster, carrying the weight of generations. The sound was no longer just rebellion. It was verdict. Whitmore's hands trembled violently. He could feel the robes suffocating him, the bench beneath. Him turning into a cage. He wanted to scream, to command, to threaten, but all he felt was the rhythm tearing his authority apart, piece by fragile piece. Carter leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. Your Honor? It seems the court has finally spoken. Whitmore's face twisted in fury and fear. This is my courtroom. I decide, but his words vanished beneath the rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Malcolm closed his eyes, listening. In that moment, the courtroom was not a place of judgment. It was a place of truth. A living, breathing heartbeat of people who refused to stay silent. When Malcolm opened his eyes again, he looked directly at Whitmore. His voice dropped to a whisper, but somehow every ear heard it. The crown doesn't fit you anymore. Whitmore froze, his grip loosened. The broken gavel slipped from his hand and clattered onto the floor, the sound swallowed by the steady rhythm. For the first time in his life, Judge Whitmore was not feared. He was pitied. The taps slowed, softening back into silence, but the silence was different now. It wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with unspoken judgment that needed no words. Whitmore slumped back in his chair, his face pale, his breaths shallow. His crown of fear was gone. All that remained was a trembling man, stripped bare before the very people he thought he ruled, and Malcolm sat in stillness once more, his presence towering above the shattered throne across from him. The clock above the bench ticked so loudly it felt like a drumbeat against Judge Whitmore's skull. Each second stretched, pulling at his nerves until his breathing became ragged, uneven. He had been in this chair for 22 years. He had sent men to prison with a flick of his wrist, silenced voices with the bang of his gavel, and strutted through the marble halls as if they were carved for him alone. But today, he could not silence the one sound he feared most, the silence of a room that had turned against him. The gallery no longer leaned forward in awe. They leaned back judging. The reporters scribbled with a hunger that made his skin crawl. And Carter's presence, that immovable presence, cut through him like a blade. Malcolm sat just below him, hands folded, posture upright, gaze steady. He was the eye of the storm, untouched by Whitmore's trembling fury. Even his silence felt like testimony, an indictment louder than words. Whitmore slammed the gavel once. Order in the court. The words were brittle. They fell flat, like stones dropped into a well without echo. Carter stepped forward, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate calm. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "the nation watches. They see not only this case, but the very character of the system you represent. I urge you to choose your next words carefully." A ripple moved through the gallery. Cameras clicked like distant gunfire. Whitmore's jaw twitched. "You come into my courtroom. This is not your courtroom." Carter cut in, his voice sharp yet calm. "This hall belongs to the people. You are not its master, only its servant. And today the people are watching to see if justice still breathes within these walls." The words hung heavy, undeniable. Whitmore gripped the gavel so tightly his knuckles blanched. His mind screamed to reassert dominance, to lash out, to crush the insolence before it grew beyond control. But his eyes betrayed him, darting to the cameras, to the young faces in the gallery, to Malcolm's unwavering calm dot, and then it hit him. Not a thought, but a feeling. For the first time in his long, decorated career, he was the one on trial. Air seemed to shift. The gallery wasn't just watching. They were measuring. Each breath he took felt weighed, dissected. His reputation, once his shield, now pressed down like a coffin lid. "You presume too much," he muttered, though the strength in his tone had vanished. Malcolm finally spoke, his voice steady low, carrying farther than Whitmore imagined possible. "No, Your Honor. For too long, men like you presume too much." It was not shouted, not embellished, yet it struck the room with the force of thunder. Heads turned, whispers surged, and for a moment, Whitmore saw his empire crumble in Malcolm's calm defiance. The judge shifted in his seat. His robe suddenly felt suffocating, heavy, like chains around his shoulders. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Carter took a step closer. "Justice demands humility. Yet arrogance has poisoned this chamber for years. It ends now, with this trial, with this case, with this moment." The silence that followed was not empty. It pulsed, alive with expectation. Whitmore lifted the gavel, his hand trembling. He wanted to bring it down, to slam it against the wood until the echoes drowned every voice in the room. But he hesitated. For the first time, hesitation betrayed him. From the back of the courtroom, a voice rang out, clear, firm, young. "My brother deserves justice." The words cut through the still air. A young woman stood, eyes wet but fierce, her fist clenched at her side. Murmurs exploded like wildfire. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching furiously. Whitmore's heart lurched. The world was no longer under his control. He could not command silence, could not dictate the story. The narrative had escaped him, carried into the world by voices he could no longer suppress. Malcolm turned, his eyes meeting the young woman's. He gave a subtle nod, acknowledgement, respect, solidarity. The gesture rippled across the room like light breaking through clouds. Whitmore slammed the gavel down weakly. "Order!" He croaked, but his voice no longer carried authority. It was a plea, not a command. Carter stepped back, his presence unyielding, his gaze locked on Whitmore. "Your Honor," he said, voice almost gentle now, "it is not the people who are out of order. It is you." The gallery gasped. The cameras captured every detail. The twitch in Whitmore's jaw, the trembling of his hand, the collapse of his certainty. In that instant, the courtroom was transformed. The balance of power had shifted. Whitmore was no longer the arbiter of justice. He was its defendant, and he knew, with a clarity sharper than any verdict he had ever delivered, that the breaking point had come. The walls of the courtroom felt closer than ever, as though the marble itself leaned forward to witness what was about to unfold. Judge Whitmore's fingers twitched against the gavel, but each second that passed stripped it of its power. The room no longer belonged to him. The gallery had grown louder with whispers, murmurs, and quiet cries that rose and fell like waves. They weren't afraid anymore, and that terrified him. Carter moved with deliberate calm, walking toward the center of the courtroom floor. Every step echoed with authority, a quiet reminder that the center of gravity had shifted. He faced the bench with his chin raised slightly, his voice sharp enough to cut stone. "Your Honor," he began, his tone almost surgical, "for years you sat high above this room, presiding as though you were untouchable. But today," he gestured toward the cameras, toward Malcolm, toward the gallery, "today the people see you, and they see what you've hidden behind this robe." Whitmore slammed the gavel down. "I will not be lectured in my own court." The sound cracked, sharp but hollow. It no longer commanded silence. It only punctuated his desperation. Malcolm rose from his seat slowly. He didn't need to speak to claim attention. The entire room turned toward him as though pulled by gravity. His movements were measured, his eyes calm, yet burning with quiet fire. He looked directly at Whitmore. "This robe doesn't make you untouchable. It only makes you responsible." The words, simple and clean, spread like fire through dry grass. Murmurs surged louder, the sound of truth sinking deep into every ear. Whitmore's throat tightened. He felt the cameras capture his twitching jaw, his sweaty brow, the anger in his eyes that could no longer be disguised as strength. Carter pressed on. The record shows a pattern of dismissals, a pattern of silencing voices like Malcolm's. But today, you cannot dismiss him. Today the world is watching, and you have nowhere to hide. Whitmore's hand shook on the gavel. He gripped it so tightly it left an imprint on his palm. His chest rose and fell in uneven bursts. From the gallery, the young woman who had spoken earlier stood again, her voice stronger now. "We will not be silent anymore." The words were echoed by others. One by one, voices rose. Men and women, black and white, young and old, their words joined into a single current. "Justice! Justice!" The chant rattled the air. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed in rapid bursts, capturing the collapse of a man who had ruled by arrogance for decades. Whitmore pounded the gavel again and again, his voice breaking. Silence. I demand silence." But the demand was a whisper against a storm. The gavel, once his weapon, now sounded like nails. In the coffin of his authority, Carter didn't flinch. He turned his head slightly toward Malcolm, then back to the judge. "Do you hear them, Your Honor? That is the sound of justice you've tried to silence. That is the verdict of the people." Whitmore's breath hitched. He wanted to lash out, to throw Carter out of his courtroom, to punish Malcolm for his calm defiance. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew it was no longer his courtroom. Malcolm stepped forward now, his voice low but carrying with unshakable force. "You can break sticks. You can shout. You can silence us for a day. But truth doesn't die, Judge. It waits. And when it comes, it breaks everything built on lies." The words fell heavy, unshakable. Whitmore's chest heaved as if each breath were a struggle against the inevitable. The chant in the gallery grew louder, fists rising into the air. The courtroom had transformed into something larger than itself, a stage where history shifted. Carter raised his hand slightly, signaling the crowd to quiet just enough for his voice to be heard again. "The gavel you hold was meant to uphold justice. But today, every strike you make against it only proves your guilt." The judge looked down at the gavel. For the first time in decades, he saw it not as power, but as weight, unbearable, damning. His hand trembled as though the wood burned against his skin. A reporter shouted, "Judge Whitmore, do you deny the accusations? Do you deny the pattern?" The camera zoomed in, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes. Whitmore's mouth opened, but the words caught in his throat. Denial felt pointless. Anger felt hollow. His silence, once a tool of control, had become confession. The gallery erupted again, not in chaos, but in resolve. They weren't afraid. They weren't bowing. They were standing. And in that moment, Judge Whitmore realized his fall had already happened. The only question left was how far he would drop. Carter's voice landed the final blow. "You are not justice. You are the obstruction of it, and this ends here." The gavel slipped from Whitmore's trembling hand. It clattered against the bench, echoing through the room like the shattering of a crown. The crowd gasped, then roared, not with fear, but with triumph. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, breathing deeply. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't demanded the fall. He had only stood with dignity. And that had been enough to bring an empire crashing down. The gavel lay on the marble floor, abandoned. Its sharp clatter still lingered in the air like the last desperate breath of a collapsing empire. Judge Whitmore stared down at it as though it had betrayed him. For years it had been his weapon, his shield, his crown. Now it was just wood. Meaningless, powerless. The courtroom was alive, buzzing with voices, chants, and the flashes of cameras. The people no longer feared his authority. They recognized it for what it had always been, a performance, built on arrogance. Whitmore's shoulders slumped under the weight of a silence he couldn't command. His lips trembled, trying to form words that might restore some sense of control. But no words came. Carter stepped forward, his expression calm but unrelenting. "History will remember this moment, Judge, not as the day you presided over justice, but as the day justice finally stood against you." The gallery erupted with agreement. Some wept, some shouted, some simply stood with arms folded across their chests, but every face carried the same truth. Whitmore's reign had ended. Malcolm, seated at the center of it all, rose once more. He didn't shout, didn't raise his fists, didn't curse the man who had humiliated him. Instead, he straightened his back, placed a hand gently on the table, and spoke with the quiet steadiness of a man who had carried far heavier burdens. "You tried to break me," Malcolm said softly, his voice carrying across the chamber. "But breaking me only showed the world who you are. "You've lost your gavel, Judge. I never lost my dignity." The words hung in the air, heavier than any verdict could be. The gallery went silent, as though even breath had paused to let the Fallery went silent. Moments settle. Whitmore's face twisted, anger, shame, disbelief all colliding. He wanted to scream, to deny, to strike back. But the cameras captured everything. Every twitch, every bead of sweat, every crack in the mask he had worn for decades. From the side, a bailiff stepped forward, hesitation in his eyes. For the first time in his career, he was not looking at the judge for instruction. He was looking at Carter, waiting, unsure. Carter nodded slightly. "Escort the judge to chambers." Effective immediately, he is recused from this case. The bailiff's hand shook as he touched Whitmore's arm. The once mighty judge jerked back, rage sparking in his eyes. "You dare lay hands on me? I am this court." But the gallery's voices rose again, louder now, drowning him out. "Justice! Justice! Justice!" Whitmore's protests vanished beneath the thunder of the chant. His voice, once the law itself, was nothing more than a fragile echo swallowed. By the people he had silenced for so long, he was led away, his robe dragging like a shadow that could no longer hide him. His figure shrank against the corridor's light, disappearing into the distance. And with him went an era of arrogance. The room held its breath. For a moment, no one moved. Then Carter exhaled deeply, placing his hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "It's done," he whispered. Malcolm's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't revenge. It was something quieter, stronger. The satisfaction of knowing that dignity had not only endured, but prevailed. Reporters surged forward, microphones and cameras flashing. Questions flew through the air. "Malcolm, how do you feel? What does this mean for the system? What comes next?" Malcolm lifted his hand gently, and the chaos stilled. His voice, calm as ever, carried above the noise. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about every voice that was silenced, every case dismissed, every truth ignored. Today isn't the end of injustice, but it is proof that when we stand together, arrogance falls, and dignity survives." The words rippled outward, settling into hearts like seeds waiting to bloom. The young woman from the gallery, the one who had first spoken out, stepped forward, tears in her eyes. She whispered, almost reverently, "You gave us our voices back." Malcolm shook his head. "No, you always had them. You just needed to believe they mattered." The crowd swelled, emotions crashing like waves. Some reached for his hand, some embraced one another, some simply stood with tears streaming down their cheeks. Carter looked around the courtroom, his jaw tight but his eyes soft. He knew this wasn't the end. The system would resist change, fight back, try to rebuild its walls. But something had cracked open today, something that couldn't be sealed again. Outside, the courthouse steps overflowed with people. Word had spread faster than fire, drawing crowds who held signs, lifted fists, and shouted with voices that shook the sky. Reporters broadcast live, their headlines already shaping the moment into history. As Malcolm walked out, the sun broke through the Timoteo clouds, casting its light across the courthouse steps. The crowd erupted in cheers, their chants echoing into the city streets. He paused at the top of the stairs, Carter beside him. For a moment, he closed his eyes, breathing in the air of freedom, not just his own, but the collective freedom of every silenced voice now awake. Carter leaned in, speaking quietly. "You know this is only the beginning, don't you?" Malcolm opened his eyes, the calm fire still burning within them. "Yes," he replied, "and that's why we'll keep standing. Because arrogance falls, but dignity never dies." The roar of the crowd rose again, carrying the words forward, carrying the movement forward. The courthouse that had once been a monument to silence now pulsed with the heartbeat of justice. And as Malcolm stepped down the stairs, surrounded by people, cameras, and history itself, one truth became undeniable. The verdict had already been delivered. Not by a gavel, not by a judge, but by the people who had finally found their voices and would never give them up again.